Okay, we're going to skip ahead from where we uh, usually start the narration of the trip by going to the Bohemian National Cemetery on Pulaski Road. There's the gate. Beautiful gate that was built in the late 19th century. If you go to Chicago, you notice that there's a whole ring of cemeteries about 3 or 4 miles from the center of the city, and that's because that was out in the boondocks 100 years ago, or 100 and more than 100 years ago. And Bohemian National Cemetery is one of the more noteworthy ones. So we're going to continue on Pulaski Road. As you can see, there are cemeteries, all kinds of different cemeteries on both sides of the road. St. Edishu Church of the North, or Church of the East, rather, like the Wicked Witch of the West. And it's an Assyrian Christian church. One of the things that we have to realize is that Christianity never left the traditional Holy Land, and then there are some very, very old Christian denominations that trace themselves all the way back to the apostles, and this is one of them. Now, it's mostly a refugee church today, especially with all of the issues going on in Syria and Lebanon. But there's a fairly cohesive community there. And one year when we went by this church, one of my students piped up back in the bus, said, "This is my church." And it turns out that I had this student, and then I had his sister a couple of years later, also in race and ethnicity. And they had some interesting things to say about being a member of a small community like that, especially with the issue of marrying outside of the ethnic group. It's hard when there aren't that many people in your ethnic group. Okay, so we're going to continue up Pulaski Road to Devon Avenue, which is the dividing line between Chicago and Lincolnwood at this point. There's the traffic light coming. Turning on to Lincolnwood is, at least today, is predominantly Jewish and Asian. A lot of people of Asian background have moved into some of the more traditionally Jewish northern suburbs like Skokie and Lincolnwood. What often happens is that if the ethnic composition of a neighborhood changes, but the churches and the stores and the restaurants stay often for many years after the departure of the people who actually live there. And what we see on Devon Avenue is several synagogues, Jewish places of worship. Is this one of them? This is one of them. I can't quite see what the church is, but it is one of the. You can go back to the map, but this is a temple. You can see the billboard that they always have posted there, showing the American flag and the Israeli flag. One of the really interesting issues that we're dealing with in our country these days is the whole question of is it anti-Semitic to oppose the policies of Israel? The argument that it isn't is becoming more mainstream than it has been in the past, and it's a serious bone of contention, nevertheless. All right, we're going to continue on Devon. The area used to be very heavily Jewish. On the other side of the UPS truck, there's still, remember what I said before about how neighborhoods, even though the people who used to live there, the ethnic group that used to live there has moved, a lot of the stores and other kinds of infrastructure stay behind. So if you want to eat kosher, you can go to that store. And presumably you can see there's a menorah. Picture was taken in August of 2019, but there's one at parking lot there. Let's see what got here. this is an example of a store that, two stores that cater to the Middle Eastern folks, Ishtar Market and Zabiha Market. They sell, many of those stores, the grocery stores sell halal meat, which is essentially the same thing as kosher, but it's the Muslim kosher. See, the Levinson's Bakery is still there from probably back in the day, old-fashioned Jewish bakery. Now we should be getting into more of the Indian businesses, aimed more at Indian folks.
I can see some Indian names now.
Yes. And I think we're getting close to, well, yes, I can see the little inset map in the back corner there. Okay. Make sure I stay on it and not go crashing down the alley again. We're almost to Patel Brothers, which is like for the students, one of the very first Indian grocery stores. And now they have, what, a dozen branches. I think they're all over the place now.
And all over the US, actually. It's originated in Chicago.
Okay. I did not know that. Trying to find a sari shop. Here's a barbecue place. Okay, here's an interesting phenomenon. Gandhi Electronics here, where they sell, you can see the sign here just barely, 110 and 220 volt appliances. Now, you can talk amongst yourselves and think about why would anybody want something that will run on 220 volt house current when all you have in the United States is 110. Well, to make a long story short, it's to send back to, or to take back to India. Apparently, Indian house current is 220. There's another halal peri peri chicken. So that's one of those wonderful ethnic blends that you see in the United States. Not having good luck with.
There's a sari shop I can see there.
Yeah, here we go. And a beauty parlor. One of the things that we notice on this trip is that people like to have their medical care and their haircut in their native language. You know, it's hard enough to get your maladies taken care of. Here we go. There's a sweets and snacks place, something very popular within the Indian community. The small plates and desserts and so forth. And
Mark, it says Pak, so is it Pakistani sweets?
Yes, actually. So they like their sweets and snacks as well, obviously. So another electronics store, another Pakistani store. The Pakistani presence has become more noticeable over time. Here's a Indian grocery store. Basmati rice, dal. Yeah. I can tell that we're getting a little bit out of the Indian neighborhood now. Actually, I have a photograph of Patel Brothers, and I'm going to call that up now. Patel Brothers grocery. So we're coming up to Ridge Avenue, and we would always stop to admire this church. It's a Croatian Christian church. And now we're going to head down Ridge Avenue, Peterson. The next neighborhood we're going to visit is Little Vietnam, which is on Broadway. Just generally Euro-American. Probably more Jewish than anything else because much of the North Side. But you know, even within my lifetime, there were areas like the Lincoln Square area, which isn't too far from here, that was German. You know, there was a whole bunch of German restaurants that people would stop at after a Cub game. So you probably had that. You had people from Sweden. The neighborhood right around Wrigley Field, even to this day, is known as Andersonville because everybody was there named Anderson. And again, the people left, but there's still, I think it's still open, Ann Sather's restaurant where you can get lingonberry pancakes and things like that. So it would have been a Euro-American restaurant. So we're turning on to Argyle Street, which is the main street of Little Vietnam. And there are about 8 places in this short distance where you can get pho, the national beef noodle dish of Vietnam. Stopped there after a ball game with my son some years ago and had probably the best pho, but everybody has their own favorite. So people argue back and forth whether tank noodle, and with, yes, that is inspired by the war. Also, Ba Li banh mi restaurant, the first place I ever had the wonderful Vietnamese banh mi sandwich, which is, it's almost enough to give colonialism a good name because it's a mixture of French and Vietnamese. It's a baguette, but it's made with rice flour, so that's already a cultural blend. It has pate, head cheese, and mayonnaise, you know, which that reflects the French influence. And then they put a pickled salad of daikon radishes and cilantro and jalapeno peppers on top. So you've got crunch, you got spice, you got it is the bomb. There's a donut shop in Algonquin called Roland Donuts that is run by people from, I think, from Cambodia, and they serve banh mi sandwiches, and they're quite good. Okay, so what you have here is a lot of places really close together. 888, those are lucky numbers in Vietnam, Vietnamese culture. Another restaurant. They did an interesting urban experiment in parking to try to manage both the auto traffic and the sidewalk traffic. They've kind of, there's no curb, there's no demarcation between the street and the sidewalk, which is kind of weird to me, but apparently all of the cool kids are doing it these days in different urban areas. Again, grocery store, tea, cafe, and note the pagoda style roof on the L platform there. Okay, what we're going to do now, and we'll take a little break. This is Lakeshore Drive. We're going to step into our magic machine and transport ourselves all the way down to Chinatown on the south side of Chicago. So through the miracle of Google Street View in Chinatown, as you can see, there's a red line stop right there at Cermak Road. We're on Wentworth Avenue, which is a north-south street. We usually would park the bus actually right here, hoping, because there's no way we could get it into the parking lots. I start out by mentioning that there's a really excellent noodle house right here that my wife and I stopped at when we were here. There's also a Chinese food court in this building in the, what do they call that? The Richland Center, Chinatown Food Court. Now this little alley here takes us into Chinatown Square, which is was developed, I think, in the 1980s. It was an area that was a railroad yard, I think, but a lot of capital came out of Hong Kong when in the 80s and 90s, as the date approached in 1999, that Hong Kong was going to be given back to China from by the United Kingdom. And that investment got translated into a building boom in this area. There's a lot of apartments, and Chinatown, by some contrast to Little Vietnam, is still very definitely a Chinese residential neighborhood. Lots and lots of people of Chinese ancestry live in this neighborhood, and it's been a Chinatown for probably a century. The sort of the old part of Chinatown. There are many, many excellent restaurants. We probably can't go in there in Google Street View because that, by definition, it keeps you out on the street. But that was usually our first stop. So what we're going to do next is go down to Archer Avenue, and I'm going to call attention to this beautiful building. It's the new public library branch, and that was always important in the field trip because it had a nice clean bathroom that we could use. Chinatown is not traditionally known for having excellent clean bathrooms. Plus, a lot of them, they say it's only for customers, which is, that's not unusual. There's a grocery store right next to the public library called Park to Shop, and we usually walk through there and look at the whole chickens hanging by their necks in the meat department and all the Chinese vegetables and so forth. There's not a lot of atmosphere, but it's a very, very good Chinese grocery. And when my wife and I are in there to eat, we always try to get something at the grocery store. So we're going to go back over to Wentworth. This is an interesting project. I was surprised when I went down there. This image was captured in August of 2019. And my wife and I went to kind of scout out this route for a potential field trip in November of 2019, and they had finished this project. They completely reoriented the street and tore down what was at one time a restaurant that was right on the corner here. And it's a good thing because this was a very tricky intersection. Okay, so here's the entrance to old Chinatown. There's a gate, Chinese style gate, and this has been a Chinese neighborhood again for a very long time. The stores are closer together. This is the community center, the Pui Tak Center, which again has been there for a long time. Kind of a ethnic self-help type of place. Very interesting building. Many bakeries in this neighborhood. Also some good places to eat. Where is it? Yeah, right there. Triple Crown. That's was for a while. We found another one we like better, but for a long time that was our favorite restaurant for dim sum, the Chinese small plates dish. Is this the street? Church? No, we have to go one. A lot of noodle houses and food markets. Yeah, I think this is the street with the church. Yes. Interesting story. It's a Saint. I'm going to look on my own picture here for a quick moment. Oh, did it again. Wrong.
The Saint Therese.
Teresa, that's it. Okay. Okay, good. Let me back to Google. Are we looking at the church in Google Earth? Google Saint Teresa. It was originally a Catholic or an Italian Catholic church. You can see we can't get a close look at the cornerstone, but it says Madonna in Coronata 1909. So, you know, our Hail Holy Queen enthroned above, basically. But as you can see, it's switched over to a predominantly Chinese Catholic church. And there's been a Christian missionary movement in China for a very long time. Many Christian missionaries lived out the World War II in China under the thumb of the Japanese, and some of them had some very unpleasant experiences. But they have masses in Cantonese, they have masses in Mandarin. For a while, there was a sign out that they had masses in Tagalog, which is the language of the Philippines. So we see this pattern of ethnic succession again, just as we've seen in Devon Avenue, and we saw it in Little Vietnam. Now we see it in Chinatown as well. So let's go back out to Wentworth. And this truck is in the way. Nothing we can do about that. But we would go into this place here, Chiu Quan, which is widely regarded as the best bakery in Chinatown. The last time that I was there with students, we had a particularly adventurous group, and they really enjoyed the bean paste cakes and lotus paste puffs and moon cakes and all that other good stuff that you find in a Chinese bakery. But they also have, as you can see on the sign, they also have dim sum. So you can get, it's a limited dim sum menu, but you can get dumplings and things like that that are more traditional lunch fare. So that's maybe just kind of, we'll go a little slower. Chicago Food Market, those are fish tanks that you can go in there and get live fish. We were there one time for the field trip, actually, and the live fish truck from Arkansas was making deliveries, and we've seen that truck maybe 5 or 6 times over the years. They seem to be making their delivery about the same time that we're in the neighborhood. And these trucks have a big tank on the back it's hydrated like a fish tank. But there was a gentleman up on the deck of the truck with like old-fashioned ice tongs, taking these big catfish out of the tank and tossing them into a huge plastic garbage can that was sitting on the sidewalk. And one of them escaped. It rimmed the garbage can and it's flipping its way down Wentworth Avenue. The guy goes and picks it up. That was, you can't that was worth a cover charge and a 2-drink minimum to watch that show. The tea house. If you like Chinese bubble tea, every place has it. They must make a lot of money off of those because everybody's got them. That's another bakery there. Restaurant specializing in seafood. Will they deliver to Crystal Lake? Alas, probably. Okay, so that's the end of Chinatown, and okay, so what we're going to do now is zoom in to 2 neighborhoods. We can see where they're located on the map. That's actually kind of nice, something that we couldn't do really before when we were going live, is to visualize in space where we are. We're 8700 South in a neighborhood called Chatham. It was developed after World War II, really. I'm not sure there was much there before that time, maybe even farmland, I don't know, but it was, from the look of the houses, it was a post-World War II neighborhood and briefly inhabited by white people, but not for long. It was as the process of neighborhood change that you've been studying took place, there was an influx of African Americans. And when I lived in Chicago, when I was in college, which is very, well, 50 years ago almost, Chatham had a reputation among African Americans in Chicago as being a little bit snooty, a little bit bougie, as they would say. Nice houses, doctors, lawyers, business people, school principals, and so forth lived in that neighborhood. And even more elite was the next neighborhood here where it says Marynook. Marynook is essentially the same thing as Chatham, but down here, Calumet Heights is the official name of the neighborhood, but it's referred to informally as Pill Hill. There are many Pill Hill neighborhoods in American cities. It's wherever the doctors live. That's why they call it Pill Hill. And in this case, there actually is a hill. Chicago's pretty flat, but there actually is a hill in Pill Hill. I chose these neighborhoods because they defy the stereotype of African American neighborhoods that you get through movies and the media. And I want to emphasize to people that there are, especially to white people, that there are millions of upper working and middle class African Americans, and they often live in places like Chatham and Pill Hill. Okay, it's the end of my, get off my soapbox for a minute. Let's go down to 87th Street in Chatham. One of the things that we notice in Chatham is there's more of the sort of the infrastructure of middle class life than you typically find in low income neighborhoods, whether they're Black or Latino. Banks, not just currency exchanges, but actual banks, chain grocery stores, full service grocery stores. You learn about so-called food deserts. This is not a food desert. And we'll see the grocery store in a minute. See, these are nice. These are these Chicago ranch houses that I just love that style. And in fact, I live in a house that looks like that. When we built our house here in Crystal Lake, I wanted one like this with the house sideways on a narrow lot with a detached garage in the back. I think that's a great architectural style. So there's a mixture of single family and multifamily homes. As you can see, they're kept up, the bushes are trimmed. There are many block clubs in these neighborhoods where, unfortunately, and this is something that is an obstacle to upward mobility for African Americans across the country, is that this neighborhood of employed people and strivers is surrounded by neighborhoods where there are fewer people working or there's more crime, and there's a tendency for that to leak over into Chatham. And tragically, about almost 20 years ago now, there was an article in the Tribune, in the magazine, about a family that had 2 generations lived in Chatham. The younger generation, the guy was maybe in his 30s, was a Chicago police officer. They talked about his father and the experiences that they had. Well, not more than a few months later, that officer was murdered by a man not from the neighborhood who was stealing his motorcycle. And unfortunately, that's an example of the challenge that upwardly mobile middle-class African Americans often have to escape the old neighborhood, especially if they don't want to move to Algonquin, let's say. Substantial brick houses, well kept. We'll work our way down 87th Street. You still have, everybody likes to eat their culture's favorite foods. And so there are chicken places and so forth in this neighborhood as well. So here's a bank with a drive-through ATM, a nail parlor, dollar stores, just like we have there's another bank, a dollar store. This neighborhood here's a freestanding chicken and seafood place. This neighborhood is very close to Chicago State University, which is student body there is predominantly Black. One thing that I've noticed, just because I'm obviously a foodie, is the popularity of Jamaican restaurants in African American neighborhoods, and also some outright African restaurants. And here's one that specializes in jerk chicken and probably jerk pork too. Good stuff, nice and spicy. Or chicken and fish. They also, it says they steam fish. You can actually bring your catch and they'll cook it for you, from what I recall. I mean, even places like Dunkin' Donuts and Baskin Robbins, that we take those for granted in the suburbs, but not to be found in all urban neighborhoods. Again, just, block after block after block of these nice houses that are kept well. There's a block club sign right there. Again, we probably can't get close enough to read it. But it basically says, we've got eyes on the street. Don't sell drugs on the street. Don't have your dog poop on the parkway and not pick it up. Don't work on your car in the driveway. Just don't sit and drink on the street, and et cetera, et cetera. That this is a nice neighborhood. And we're trying to keep it that way. Informal social control, we call that in sociology. And of course, if you don't have that, doesn't matter how effective your police are, they can't keep the lid on. Here at Popcorn Shop, that's, as you know, and again, kind of a suburban style shopping center, strip mall, the Subway, and the Popcorn Shop. That stuff is good. This is a historic building on the south side. It's the home of Travis Realty. One of the other issues that has had a powerful impact, negative impact, on the ability of African Americans to build wealth has been their systematic exclusion from the real estate market. There have been many really good books written about this, even right up to the present day. Access to mortgages, access to the housing market. Back in the 1950s, they didn't have Zillow, where you could go and find out everything about a house that's for sale and then call your realtor. You had to have access to a realtor who then in turn had access to the multiple listing service and could tell you what houses were for sale in a given neighborhood and how much. The National Association of Realtors was almost entirely white and didn't deal with blacks, and even their code of ethics said it was unethical, they said, for a realtor to sell a house in a white neighborhood to black people. So if you were African American and you wanted to buy a house, it was so much more difficult than it would have been for a white person of the same income or the same occupation to be able to do. Well, Dempsey Travis was one of the first, or maybe the first, African-American realtor in Chicago. He didn't have an office, or he had maybe, he worked out of his house. His office consisted of a clipboard and a 5-gallon bucket, and he would go and turn the bucket over and sit there and talk to his customers. He also tackled the problem of African Americans getting mortgage credit by setting up a finance company, Sevart Mortgage Company, which is Travis spelled backwards. There's the building. Dempsey Travis himself lived to be about 98 years old. He was a amateur historian and was quite an authority on jazz in Chicago. I'm not even sure that the business is still in business, but it was very important in Black Chicago, and he's a hero, really, of Chicago and a very important part of our history. And we're leaving on the wrong side of the street, leaving Woo, psychedelic. Chatham. We weren't able to look at this building. I'm pretty sure this is it. It's because of road construction, and we were there before. It's the studios of WVON radio. As you may know, a lot of the old radio stations in Chicago, the call letters actually mean something. WCFL was owned by the Chicago Federation of Labor, CFL. WGN radio was owned by the Tribune, and the Tribune's been known as the world's greatest newspaper, WGN. Well, WVON, VON stood for the voice of the Negro. And when I was a kid, before the rise of FM radio, there were only a few stations that young people would listen to for popular music, and it was uphill both ways in the snow, and you kids get off my lawn. But the white kids would listen to WLS or WCFL, and black kids mostly listened to WVON. And so did, there were programs that catered to older African Americans too. So there was jazz on WVON well into the 80s. And it was located in this. If you don't have banks in a neighborhood, the only place you can go if you need money is to a payday loan. And they charge exorbitant interest rates. And they tend to suck the life out of low-income neighborhoods. Suburban style strip malls with a Chinese restaurant and an H&R Block. Those kinds of, again, the infrastructure of middle-class life is found in a neighborhood like this. A mattress firm, well, here's Pete's grocery store. Let's go up a little bit farther. And as you can see, they bill it as a produce store. Let's see what's on sale. Grapes, greens, it caters to the African American clientele. Ooh, we can go into the parking lot. Catfish. But fresh groceries, something again that we take for granted in suburbia, but not to be taken for granted. Rib tips. Good stuff. Okay, we're going to go on to Stony Island. Now we're moving into Pill Hill. Some of the houses, especially in the kind of the western edge, aren't that different from the houses in Chatham, although there is one really distinctive feature of this neighborhood, and apparently one must keep one's shrubbery carefully trimmed. And I don't know if I'd be able to manage in this neighborhood, but you got to have your electric hedge trimmer, I think, to get by. Now the houses, this is a good example of the architecture. One, it's got a garage and a driveway, which is not much more of a suburban type of amenity. And the houses remind me, a million years ago, I worked for ChemLawn spraying fertilizer on people's lawns. And one of the areas that I worked in quite a bit was Mount Prospect. And there were some neighborhoods in Mount Prospect that were built about the same time as, there's the bushes, aren't those awesome? In the 50s and 60s, very similar architecture to this neighborhood. And it is an overwhelmingly, I would probably say 99% African American neighborhood. I got to look at some of these shrubs. We usually come up a little ways here and turn to the south, and you'll be able to see the actual, why they call it. It's accurate to call it Pill Hill. This is actually uphill. Look at that house. We're on South Creighton Avenue. Very much contrary to the stereotype. Somebody's out there mowing their lawn. Well, there's the landscaper. Oh, that's perfect. I can't, sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. Where did the landscape truck go? Well, the only neighborhood that I've seen, one of the few neighborhoods where you would see a Mexican landscaping crew mowing a black family's lawn. That very sociologically significant stuff. Okay, we're now going to visit Little Village, which is one of my favorite places to visit in Chicago. Students seem to enjoy it as well. It's been called Little Village for a long time, all the way back into the late 19th, early 20th century, when a lot of people who lived there had come from little villages in Bohemia. It was an Eastern European neighborhood. And over the last 30 years or so, maybe even longer than that, it's become a predominantly Hispanic neighborhood, mostly people of Mexican ancestry. And now it's people who came from little villages in Mexico. It's sometimes known in Spanish as La Villita, meaning little village, or just 26th Street or Calle 26, or South Lawndale. It has a number of different aliases. But again, we see the history of ethnic succession, the story that really comes out when we go on this trip. Now we're on the near what we would describe as the near southwest side. We would take the Stevenson Expressway to get out to the neighborhood and get off on Kedzie Avenue and come up to Little Village. So we're going to go to kind of the heart of Little Village, the intersection of Kedzie and 26th Street. Whoops. Please zoom in. There we go. Here's 26th Street. We don't, we usually turn, we're farther west when we make our turn on to 26th Street, and you have to kind of look back to see this, but now we got to take a good look at it. The Bienvenidos Little Village arch. So you have an arch here, just like you have in Chinatown. I read somewhere a few years ago that the city of Chicago gets more sales tax revenue from 26th Street than from any other shopping district in the city besides North Michigan Avenue. And I can believe it, because you've got everything. You've got furniture, libreria, you've got all kinds of grocery stores, gas stations, food, or zapateria. You've got all kinds of Mexican ice cream parlor. That's something you don't see, although we're seeing the Mexican ice cream parlors, but this is a cremeria, which is really kind of, it's a cheese store, basically, you know, and an enduring theme on this field trip is sending money home. When we did the bus field trip, I would ask students to see in how many different languages can you send money home, and you see this in Little Village as well. Get your car fixed. There's lots of medical establishments. People still go out for pizza and gyros and a hot dog, even in this neighborhood. Big grocery store, jewelry store. big Mexican restaurant. Apparently, big seafood specialty, Ricos Mariscos, rich, good tasting seafood. But I'm not seeing, oh, okay. And one of the things that you see in any Mexican neighborhood is the street vendors. Here's that looks like they sell elotes with the Mexican corn on the cob. Some of them specialize in drinks. We would always go, here's another cart. We would make the trip in the fall, and they would often have champurrado, which is a variety of atole, which is a drink that's made with corn. And it's got a kind of a thick texture to it, grainy texture. School uniforms, things for baptisms and first communions. You like to get a lawyer who speaks your language. So here's a abogado. Oh, good. I was hoping to see a quinceañera store. There's a lot of dress shops in the neighborhood, just like there are sari shops. So I'm I can't resist. I'm sorry that we didn't get a good look at a sari shop on Devon Avenue, but we'll have to work on that. More vendors. You also have a lot of stores on 26th Street that sell Western wear, boots and cowboy hats. Medical, everything, general medicine, obstetrics, gynecology, and fertility. Yet you still have Zemsky's Family Fashions. Look at that neon sign. Boy, they don't make them like that anymore. But in a bookstore, Spanish bookstore next door, I'm guessing that that Lemsky's has been there for an extra special long time. 8 years ago, I think, because it looked like it had a clean restroom, and we were about ready to head back to Crystal Lake, and we needed a nice place to go potty. So it was my first experience at a Mexican neveria y fruteria, Mexican ice cream parlor. And they have paletas, the popsicles, and there's a picture of a mangonada, which is with mangoes, and fruteria, mangonada, and they have hot food too. You know, you can get the they call them chicharrones, but they're not pork rinds. It's those of you of Mexican ancestry in the class know what I'm talking about, probably but it's made out of wheat. It's like a waffle, and you put all kinds of stuff on it. You can get the walking tacos and all kinds of interesting dollar store. Everybody's got dollar stores. Somewhere along here, and again, I didn't get the address, is the Chicago House of Live Poultry. And students would always be grossed out, that you don't, yeah, there it is. Ha ha! There we go. Live chickens and poultry. We walked in there one time, and boy, does it smell horrible in there. But the point is that if you eat meat, it used to be something that was walking around on its hind legs, and somebody had to make it dead, and it probably wasn't a pretty sight. So, if the idea of live poultry that you buy to take home or freshly killed to take home grosses you out, you might think about being a vegetarian. If you do eat meat, you really have to kind of accept the fact that something has to get killed for you to eat. But they have ducks, rabbits, chickens, and it looks like, I can't quite make it out on the side of the building, there's a hand lettered, they also have turkeys and ducks, pigeons and quail. well, there they are in the mural, which is also as some of you know, a great tradition in Mexican culture of public. Okay, one of the things that comes up in a food truck, one of the things that comes up in sociology of race ethnicity is the concept of environmental racism. The idea that you put the dump, the landfill, the dirty factory and so forth, that always seems to be adjacent to the Superfund toxic waste cleanup site seems to be close to neighborhoods of low-income minority people. Well, this is the Crawford Power Station. It's a decommissioned coal-fired power station. It's called Crawford because Pulaski Road used to be called Crawford Avenue. It's been there for a long time. It is one of those ornate, old-fashioned industrial buildings. It was seen as a case of environmental racism because that big smokestack that you see would drop a lot of, when the wind was right, it would drop a lot of cinders and dust into the little village neighborhood. You can see it's not very far away. So it would get on people's laundry that was hanging out and so forth. And so there were calls by neighborhood activists to close the plant. On the other hand, a lot of people who lived in Little Village worked at that plant. So there were some really complicated issues at stake. Bottom line is that the plant was closed and it was decommissioned, sat empty for some years. And in recent years, the plot of land that it's on was sold to build a warehouse. And they're tearing down the plant. And in fact, it's gone, or there's just a little bit of it left. But you know, you can't make this stuff up. I'm going to move up a little closer. When they knocked that chimney down, their smokestack down, it raised a gigantic cloud of dust. And it wasn't supposed to do that. When they got their permission from the city to tear the factory down, they weren't supposed to, they were supposed to contain the dust. So this giant cloud of dust blew into Little Village, so that even though they were trying to tear it down and put up something that was not as environmentally harmful, they still did environmental harm. So now they're trying to figure out where there are toxic metals in there from the years of it being a smokestack. The other wrinkle, and I wasn't aware of this, is that there are the same neighborhood activists who were concerned about the power plant are concerned about the warehouse because there's going to be hundreds of diesel trucks idling and coming and going and so forth, and that might pollute the air. So, you know, it's almost like, what are you going to do? They're out of the frying pan and into the fire, I guess. When you look at the architecture of that place, it's almost a shame that they had to tear it down. They don't build power plants that look like that anymore. Okay, and that concludes our trip. Basically what we do at this point when we do the bus trip is we go down to the Stevenson and get back on and head to Crystal Lake, and everybody falls asleep. So don't you fall asleep in class. We're watching you. Students that, especially if you're not from any of these neighborhoods, that we look on them as exotic neighborhoods, that almost like we're on a safari. You know, we're looking at we're spectators, and we're looking at the weird way they trim their bushes and so forth. But if we look at what is familiar to most of us, territory out in McHenry County, if we look at it with fresh eyes, can we notice things that are just as distinctive, as quote unquote weird, as the things that we were looking at in the city? Here we are in Crystal Lake, coming up past Crystal Lake South High School. Let's drive through the neighborhood a little bit and just kind of take a look around. Not sure what we're going to find. On Dartmoor Drive. Okay, that was I didn't see any boats in people's driveways in Chicago, now that I think about it. That might be something that if you were, new to town or a camper, boats and campers. There's another camper. Ha!